Hey y'all, this is Matthew here, and welcome back to another Christian type deep talk. And I know that labeling of this deep talk is definitely a little bit out of the blue, but I did definitely want to make sure that I let you guys know, for the most part, going forward, Sundays and Wednesdays are going to be my Christian deep talks, and going forward, Fridays are going to be as much as possible. Going to be the days I actually work on my other deep talks, like the more gaming centric the one, or the more history type center one. Is going to be on Friday. Now, of course, depending on how wiped I am, it may come out Saturday or Sunday. But basically, I am going to work, start working, may I say, on consistently uploading some deep talks on those 3 days, and we'll see how it goes from there. Even if it's not on those specific days, I'm at least going to record it on that day, and I may release it the day after, or like the day of. We'll see how that goes, but whew, beyond. We will see how that goes going forward. But thankfully, today we are going to be able to finish up and cover the last of the three, basically roadmapped deep talks that I had planned out and I had posted up on my Instagram. If you don't have it, go ahead and follow that. I believe it should still be active on my about section. If not, I'll update it at some point in the near future whenever I'm not sleeping or working. But yeah, so this one is going to be on the necessity, basically, of agape love in your marriage. And this is definitely something, obviously I'm not married yet, but it's definitely something that I 100% really want to make sure that I have down before I get married, especially since I'm getting closer, thank God, day by day in regards to that. Um, and I do feel it is a very important and, if anything, a little bit under discussed topic. Um, and what I mean by the need for agape love in a marriage is, I would say, very self evident in a very common sense. Because, look, times are going to come your way at some point. It's I would say it's very inevitable. Whether it's financial, whether it's romantic, whether it's physical intimacy, whether it's faith, whether it's taking care of your kids, whether it's any of those topics, and even more than I'm not thinking of at the moment. But the necessity of agape love, of unconditional love, um, if anything, the necessity to strive for agape love, or aka unconditional love, is immeasurably important, especially in this day and age where social media, all that stuff, like movies, YouTube, for the vast majority, let's be honest here, isn't exactly pushing the narrative of like, hey, look, you may have bad times in your marriage, where you're frustrated, or you're just kind of burnt out, or something's going on at work and it's frustrating you, or maybe you don't feel like it was with your husband or your wife at the beginning of your marriage, and you're struggling like a year in, maybe even a month in, or like whatever case is going on. You're having trouble with your marriage, in that sort of way, with the love part. Because fundamentally speaking, from what I've seen, both from my parents and from people I know, is obviously love is just one aspect, and I'm definitely going to need to get into a couple different more segments, speaking about the aspects of marriage, because I'm doing this not only to kind of put it out to you guys for my thoughts on it, but also to help myself and my future wife prepare for marriage together, spending the rest of our lives together. Because I feel like, realistically, especially when it comes to personalized meditations and thoughts, and really having that conversation with your future husband or your wife or your fiance or your girl or your man, whatever the case is, you know whichever end of the aisle you're a part of, is like, look, like you definitely need to start, you know, preparing for both the good times, you know, the bad times, the hard times, the easy times. And you know, I don't really subscribe to the whole, like, you know, the whole, you know, honeymoon phase, because at the end of the day, realistically speaking, you should always, you know, not see it as like, oh, there's going to be a honeymoon state, you know, phase, and then it's going to end. Like, realistically speaking, you know, especially if you're actively, you know, working on strengthening your marriage and strengthening your relationship together, and really preparing, you know, each other and helping each other, you know, work towards, you know, the understanding of like, hey, look, like, we're going to be together for the rest of our lives. You know, this is not something we're gonna, you know, optionally be like, oh, well, we have the option to divorce. Like, no. Like, especially in Christian marriages, you know, I know that's very much I feel like it's becoming more of such a normality with divorce these days, you know, when the going gets tough, that it's like, okay, well, you know, the love was there, you know, but it's not anymore, you know. And like, you know, if you want me to be happy, right? And that's the thing, though, is like, look, you make a sacred vow in front of God, you know, to spend the rest of your life with this person. Like, obviously, you know, as God dictates, you know, if there is, you know, cheating or anything like that, or, you know, or death, you know, obviously death do us part, you know, that's, you know, that's an aspect of that. But other than that, like, you need to be able to really, you know, work with your husband or your wife, you know, and use that unconditional love that you should have for each other, and help that, you know, use that to help you, you know, get through whatever comes your way. Because at the end of the day, like, look, like, when push comes to shove, you know, if your husband or your wife truly does have, you know, agape love, or like truly strives to have agape love every day of their lives, you know, they're not going to give up on you. They're not going to just be like, oh, well, I'm not happy, you know, and, you know, they say the D word, you know, like, I want a D, you know, I want a divorce, you know, whatnot. So I'm just saying, like, you know, I think as Christians these days, you know, we really do need to be very mindful with not, you know, even having divorce be a part of, like, you know, something that you even consider, you know, unless, of course, there's, you know, cheating, or, you know, anything of that sort, or death, you know, or, you know, sickness of that, you know, leads to death, type of thing like that. And I think it's a very solemn subject that we as Christians really need to consider and really think through, really pray, and talk to God about, because, you know, we need to think on the daily, like, hey, like, what am I doing to really exemplify the fruits of the Spirit? You know, joy, love, joy, peace, long suffering, you know, truthfulness, you know, faithfulness, all that sort of stuff. Like, you need to apply that to your marriage, you know, every day of your lives, because there's going to be days, you know, like I said, where you're going to be tired, you're going to be worn out, you know, and, you know, a lot of times, you know, a lot of that stuff comes out, you know, on both sides of the aisle, you know, where it's like, you know, it can be easier to not really, you know, be forthright, be, you know, transparent with your husband or your wife, and really, you know, be 100% truthful with what, you know, you feel, because, you know, you don't want to hurt them, but, you know, at the same time, you just don't want to bother, you know. And you have to think about, like, look, is this really agape love? Like, am I loving them unconditionally, you know? And will this affect, you know, how our relationship is, you know, as a husband and wife, you know? Because at the end of the day, like, you know, me, the person next to you, your neighbor, you know, whatever the case is, like, you need to remember, like, hey, look, like, my solemn duty, you know, my solemn vow to God, in front of God, in front of the witnesses that attended your wedding, is like, look, like, I'm gonna be spending the rest of my human life with it, you know, with my husband and my wife. And you definitely should not be thinking at any point, it's like, hey, look, you know, the going's getting a little tough, we're having some, you know, struggle communicating, maybe I should just get divorced. You know, that should not pop in your brain. It should be like, hey, look, like, I know this isn't, you know, perfect, or anything like that, as much as we may have wanted it to be. and you need to own up to it. Both you, your husband, and or you, as the husband, with the wife, and vice versa. Like you need to really sit down and be like, hey, look, like I know times have been tough recently, and whatever the issue is, whether it's communication, whether it's being transparent, whether it's listening and being submissive to your husband, and as a husband, making sure you lead your wife, virtuously and ethically and morally, and as a wife, following the leadership of your husband, and not being afraid of if you're having any doubts, as to the moral, strength, or the ethical aptitude, of your husband, that your husband is showing off, don't be afraid to question that, because at the end of the day, you both need to hold each other accountable. And that's honestly also where, agape love comes in, of like, hey, look, like, I know things may get stressful between us, when we're having disagreements, or if it gets extreme, like if we're having an argument about something, like, are you really going to be honoring God at the end of the day by doing all that? Obviously it is going to happen, but especially, as a Christian, you need to remember of like, hey, look, like God went through, so much, to help us, get to this point. Would we be doing a service or a disservice to him by doing this, and, definitely I feel like more Christian husbands and wives need to be thinking, especially when they're having an argument, with their spouse, of like, hey, like, is it what Jesus would do, in this situation or whatnot, and it saddens me to say, like, look, at the end of the day, no, like, that's not a very common thing, that happens in this day and age, and I feel like, especially when it comes to the whole, oh, I'm falling out of love with you, like, that is a very, very secular thing, like, that's the thing, is like, if you feel like you're going to be falling out of love with the man or woman you're going to marry, that you're marrying, like, you definitely should not get married, because you are not ready to, stick it out for the long haul, not even for the haul, for the rest of your life. And like, you need to take that seriously, because, you know if the other person is very much a wholehearted, Bible believing Christian or whatnot, believes in God, and they themselves are like, I'm kind of feeling a little cold on this, wink, wink, whatever the case is, like, hey, look, like, no, like, that's not cool, that's not appropriate, so I think it's definitely something that should be taken into account, of like, hey, look, like, I understand that I, as a husband, or I, as a wife, am getting frustrated, for whatever cases, but it shouldn't be of like, oh, well, I'm gonna hold this against them, or like, hey, like, this is pushing me closer to divorce. Like, no, that should not even come to your mind. It should be like, hey, look, I understand that we had this difficult, interaction together, whatever, but we need to, pray together with God, really meditate on it, maybe have a few Bible studies, either, with, with, with your pastor, or alone, fellowshipping with each other. It needs to be something that you fundamentally, naturally do, or you need to work on that, because it's not something that should be, oh, you shut down, you don't want to have discussion, on an important topic, because at the end of the day, fundamentally speaking, you need to be able to do that, because if you're not able to do that with your husband or your wife, how are you going to be able to do that with your children? And I'll even add on to that, if you're able to do it with your, with your child, and you're not able to do that with your husband or your wife, there's something seriously wrong. Because, look, at the end of the day, and I know some people may be like, oh, this is not fair to the kid, or whatnot, but like, at the end of the day, look, you can have more children, or you can adopt more children. You cannot replace your husband or your wife. There's only one of them. There's only one Matthew. There's only, you know, one winner, as an example. Like, I can never replace, my future wife. That's not something that I ever will ever aim to do. And like, using my parents as an example, there is no replacement for my mom, for my dad. And they're, and they're vice versa. My mom can't replace my dad, as much as, they have, and they've had plenty of, back and forth over the years, and it's something that, like, hey, look, like, I have to commend on mom, because I've seen plenty of couples in this day and age who've said that they're Christians, and when push comes to shove, like they've just gone the way of the divorce. And honestly, I have to say that these days it's such a get out of free card, get out of free, get out of, um, yeah, get out of jail free card type thing. Like, it's like, oh, well, I'm struggling, blah, 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 I'm gonna dip, it's, or like, I feel like the new one of that, or in general, of like, that's just not appropriate, as a Christian, is like, oh, well, I'm falling out of love, and that's something I just really hate to hear, because it's not Christian in any sort of way. Like, what do you mean you fell out of love? We made the vow, both of us in front of God, like to spend both, through sickness and health, like rich or poor, all that. Like, we vowed to God, like, hey, we're gonna make it to the finish line. We're gonna make it till death do us part. And you're like, oh well, I'm dipping out. And that's the thing. That's the thing. That's why I say, if you feel that way, like I posted a short that exemplified that. Like, hey, like, look, if you feel like you need that, single quote unquote era in your life, or you feeling like, oh shoot, it's a lot. I need a break. Like, I need that. I need to just be away from my husband. I need to get drunk with the girls. I need to go into girl shit. Like, that is not the answer. That is not the answer. It's not Christian. There's no moral, you have no moral high ground there. And here's the thing. As Christians, like, we always need to make sure that we have the moral high ground. If you look at this situation and you can't say for certain, 100%, that, if God was sitting next to you and you were gonna tell him that, like, oh, I'm gonna go out with girls for like a week, we're gonna get drunk, we're gonna go to Vegas, we're gonna party, we're gonna do some sketchy stuff, that that God would be like, what incarnation are you doing? You're married. You made that vow. Like, why are you cheating on your husband with lust, towards other, males that are not your husband? Like, no. Like, that is definitely something that I 100% know for certain that happens more so than not these days with that sort of thing. And it very much is troubling because, like, when I have a future, son or daughter, especially if, they're a daughter, if it's my daughter, I very much am like, hey, look, like, do not, have these sort of girls who, like, say that sort of stuff and, like, really believe that's okay. Don't have them as your friends, or like, do not have them as your compatriots. Like, that is not appropriate, and as a man, like, especially if I have a son, like, it's definitely something I'm very concerned with him about, because, like, especially when it comes to the whole, it's like the premarital party thing, with all the girls and all the guys, you know, separately, of course. That's definitely something that I am very concerned about as well. In this day and age, is like the amount of debauchery that, like, I feel like on both sides of the aisle, to a certain extent, feel like you are allowed to do, just because of, like, hey, like, tomorrow or whatever, I'm getting married, I can do whatever the hell I want. I can have strippers there, I can have, male strippers there, I can do all this stuff, before I get married. Nah, like, that's not Christian, that's not appropriate. And I'm gonna be honest. I'm gonna be 100% honest. Like, if I ever find out that my girl, my future wife, is doing that sort of thing, that inappropriate sort of thing, like, we're done. We are done. Like, I do not stand for that sort of stuff. And I don't tolerate that sort of stuff. 100%. I don't find that stuff funny. I don't find it, something to laugh about. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's definitely something I do 100%. Um, want to really touch more of in a future, Sunday or Wednesday type episode, for Christian Deep Talk, of just the sheer debauchery these days of that, and it's very frustrating, because a lot of people who call themselves Christians are like, oh, that's okay to do, they're like, and they really think that it's okay, but I am very much of the mind of like, hey, look, can you say for certain that you have the moral high ground when it comes to that? You have the ethical high ground of that. Would you do that if God was in our presence? Would you be like, hey, look, I want to go do that? And do you think like because it is also one of the things where like it's not only if God was there, like if your man was there, if you think that's okay, like, and if you think that's okay, and he or she would say no, are you really honoring them? Are you really showing them respect? I'm just saying, like, it's definitely something we as Christians need to think of. But yeah, that's gonna be it for this. And wow, ended up being 20 minutes. But I hope you guys enjoy this, and I hope you guys are able to take away stuff from it. But yeah, this is Matthew here, logging out, and au revoir.